Um, Hello, good afternoon. I'm Maria Teresa Chadwick, or Tere Chat, maybe it's easier. And I will be presenting tonight not VR but real. This was my research and dissertation at the Royal College of Art. So if anyone wants to have a deeper look, then I can borrow my dissertation. So my main recent research question was how the touch screen supports collective connections. So if we parcel this question, it has three main kind of like factors. One would be the touchscreen technology. The other one would be the way we connect. And the third thing would be the idea of the collectiveness. So this image here, it's from a sculpture I did in Spain. It was inspired by the Earth ships that I don't know if any of you have seen an Earth ship. It was a type of architecture invented by Michael Reynolds. He's an architect from the United States. And he constructed always with garbage. So this sculpture here is made with cob and bottles, glass bottles. So what's very interesting is that when you get inside, you actually see the light changing and you can experience different sounds, almost like a musical instrument of the wind. And why I was interested in trying to use this language in a sculptural way and not with a kind of like functional purpose is because I like the idea that it engages a community, because I cannot construct the sculpture without having a community that has recycled materials. So I like the idea of making a monument that is owned by a community, because it kind of like changes the concept of the contemporary art world, where it's all about the ego of the artist. And this idea of the sculpture is to make actually to give a space for a community, to make a monument. So to start, some of you have already received a sheet of a paper. And if you like, you can download that app that's for free. And with that, you can access to the augmented realities I will be showing. And I would like to start with a quote of Byung-Chul Han. He's a professor from the University of Berlin of the art faculty. And in his book, Psychopolitics, he says, "Today, our perceptive apparatus itself is incapable of arriving to any conclusion. It just clicks it through the endless digital net. Our senses are completely distracted." So when I was writing my dissertation in my practice, I'm very interested in the hands and in the way we connect with the hands. Because somehow with the appearance of touch screen technology, I feel that even though it was an apparatus that was made to connect us, it somehow divides us and makes us even more individualistic. So I've been researching a lot about it. But also, I feel that starting with a kind of like apocalyptical theory that phones are going to destroy humanity and human relations and etc., it's also not a solution. So then I wanted to see how could actually phones be a tool that could help us to connect instead of kind of like phrasing the question in a negative way. On the other hand, I wanted to use augmented reality in a way of almost laughing or making it as a joke, of that forcing the person who reads the dissertation to use the phone and actually like tell to him, like, I know that you have your phone in your pocket, so you can take it outside and use it. And it's also a different way of understanding books and the way that we experience like a writing material, because in that sense, I do think that technology offers many possibilities. But on the other hand, I feel that the risk is that technology is somehow detaching us from reality. And as human beings, I think that we have the capacity of inventing an abstract world of ideas. And we get to such a level of disconnection that we don't care about our own environment. And I do think that's a kind of like big issue. So when this image here, it's the inside of the sculpture I showed you before. In an image, it's a bit difficult to really transmit the experience inside, because you need to be a bit longer inside and you actually experience how the light changes through the different bottles. But it maybe kind of like gives you a bit of the feeling of the structure. And also kind of like another innovation I did through my dissertation was mixing the academic writing with also anecdotes. And these anecdotes were written in a kind of like magic realistic style, because somehow I wanted to show how news and fake news are being used and manipulating our unconsciousness, because we somehow feel that we don't even know if what we're reading is true or not true anymore. So that's why I was using this kind of like magic realistic style, so that actually the reader would be confused about what was academic writing and what was the anecdote, and where was the truth and where it was not. And the other kind of thing I did that is very particular for our dissertation is that instead of going into just one topic, I did 8 small different chapters that responded to the main question, because I somehow wanted to portray how we are constantly browsing in our phones, but we don't have the capacity to stay into one subject anymore. We're constantly being like disconnected, so we don't finish to read a news and we have to open a new one. And we don't finish to send a chat or a message and we have to open a video. And I think that this might have implicances in our kind of mental health. So the different chapters, they all respond to the main question. And first I will start speaking about our disposable world, then about the idea of the societal collapse. I will continue about speaking about the screen disconnection, to follow up with the concept of the emptiness of joyfulness of our society. Then I will stop in the society of the spectacle. I will also speak about the haptic connection. I will show an experiment I did where I contrasted the physical and digital materiality. And I will conclude with the idea of connecting and collaborating. And then as an extra thing, I will show a couple of videos of another project. So this is my first image that if you would like, you can scan. So, hold on. There it is. Well, for the ones that cannot scan it, there's a video showing how the image should show. And it is an icon of some saddlebags. So this all started because I was cycling in London. My bag fell from my bicycle and a car passed over and damaged it. Then I wanted a new bag. I went to eBay and the new bag was destroyed before 1 week. So at the beginning, I was not going to complain because I felt like, well, why should I lose my time for £25? But then I felt if we all as consumers have this mentality, then we just allow this kind of market that is just producing disposable objects. So when I emailed this guy, the guy said to me like, oh no, this is your fault because you bought the cheap bag. I can offer you the one of £300. And I was like, but what is this, you know? And I replied to him, but I'm sorry, sir, you are responsible for what you produce, for what you sell. And he said, no, because I'm a seller. My job is only to send something efficiently to your house. But my job is not to verify the quality of what I sell. And then the discussion kept on a bit more aggressively when the guy even said that he was going to make sure I never bought anything of him anymore. So I finally said, you know what, you gave me a very good idea for an arts project. So this was an installation where I basically just put trash. It was called Not VR But Real. And it was done in an exhibition called What Can We Make and Become last year in, I think it was in April, May, in a venue called Exposed Arts Projects in London. This venue used to be an old garage to repair cars, Jaguars principally, and where the Queen used to repair her cars. So the place was abandoned and was full of trash as well. So I left all this trash And in the left, on the sofa, there were all the messages from the eBay driver, eBay seller, I'm sorry. And then I placed it back on the middle, and I left some VR glasses because actually you cannot see VR through here. You just thought trash. That's a reality. So what I wanted to somehow, people read the messages and kind of like laugh with it because it was an irony of how we're producing so much trash. What do we do with it? And in this virtual reality, in the image I presented, you can actually see a virtual reality of the same installation that is also playing with this kind of idea of what is real, what do we consider as real. So then this brings me back to the idea of the societal collapse. And in 2016, I presented my first exhibition in Easter Island. That was a jewelry collection called Fusión Hakapiri. I was lucky enough to visit Easter Island 2 times in 2014 and 16. And for me, when they offered me to do a jewelry collection for Easter Island, the first thing I did was starting to research because I'm Chilean, but I'm from the continent. And it's a totally, Easter Island, for the ones who don't know, is an island in the Polynesia. And it belongs to Chile, like politically, but culturally it's totally different because it's in the Polynesia. So I felt it was not proper to me just go and impose ideas to Easter Island without doing deep research. And when you start researching about Easter Island, it's very impressive because basically it was a civilization that managed to be a very evolved civilization because they even had like some petroglyphs where you can see like astronomical signs. So they had a star studies or whatever. And they got to the point that they were very wealthy, but then they overpopulated the island and they started with a civil war and they extinguished almost everything. Then Western people arrived. They took some people to be slaves, and between their own civil war and the Western invasion, they survived 112 people. And then those people have mixed with Chileans, and it's what's now actually Easter Island. And here in this necklace, it's why I want to show this image. It's because it's a representation of the principal god of the ancient Rapa Nui civilization that was Makemake. I was very interested on finding some research of Otto Klein, that he was an archaeologist that did a big study about the mask of Makemake. And one of the things he found that he could trace with carbon dating was that the older representation of the Makemake had a more like mystical image. It was more connected to the idea of a bird, that it's a representation you can see in the 2 little circles in the left. Yeah, whereas the more modern representation, that it belongs to the period of the Civil War, is less like mythological, is more rational, and is more reduced. And each time they start like simplifying and transforming it into an anthropomorphic figure of a human, that it's a representation from the right. And well, you can scan this image now that is connected to this, but when I read a book, I don't know if anyone knows or has heard about Jared Diamond. Jared Diamond is a professor from UCLA, and he did a fantastic book that's called Collapse, where he describes how many civilizations have collapsed around the world. And the chapter of Easter Island, a friend of mine gave part of the research, and he suggested me to read this book. And what's very shocking about this book is that when you read the chapter of Easter Island, there are 2 things that I could feel that they could be comparable to our situation in the world. One is that Easter Island was so isolated because it's basically 6-hour flights from Chile and like 5 hours flights to Tahiti. It's the inhabited place most isolated of the world, that they have like the small world. And the different tribes in the island, the economical system was supported in a kind of like globalized economy, because one tribe had to exchange with the other one to actually sustain their economy. So this was an example of a civilization where everyone was depending from the other one and everything collapsed. And they even managed to cut down all the palm trees of the island. That was their main economical source for everything, to have to keep warm the houses in winter. And they cut all the trees. They extinguished many species. So sometimes, so that's why you can see the image of the cutted palms. But can you imagine that's what Jared Diamond says in his book. Can you imagine what the person who cut the last tree felt, knowing that basically he was cutting the last tree of the island? Because we sometimes feel like, oh, maybe this will never happen to us. But it actually has happened in many civilizations. And what I find interesting in what you see in the book of Jared Diamond, that a common pattern between all civilizations that collapse is at the time that they start rationing more resources, they also become more into a rational set of mind. So when you think about the word rational, it has the same etymological root than ration. So I believe or feel that one of our biggest mistakes of the modern times is that we have only encouraged the rational thinking over the emotional part or the connection with the haptic sensitivity. And I feel there has to be a balance, because when there's an imbalance, and if we just go into the rational thinking, we're just thinking about reducing and rationing, and we're not connecting with our emotional part. And that's, I think, is a common pattern in many civilizations that collapse. So this is another image that you can scan. And the anecdote for this one starts in 2011 in El Cairo, where I was with my family as a tourist visiting Egypt. And suddenly the Friday of Anger started. And so we couldn't go back to the hotel. It was very hard. Oh, but well, so, and I remember that night trying to go back to the hotel, that I was really scared because but there were people with bazookas and very aggressive. I was seeing explosion, helicopters. I mean, it's the most horrendous thing I've seen in my life. And when we managed to arrive to the hotel, we were 5 days in curfew before we got a plane ticket to leave Cairo. And one of the things that I have always questioned back is that we gathered that night. I was with 10 of my cousins, and we gathered at my grandmother's room. And it was so strange because we turned on the TV, we were watching CNN, and we were seeing the bombings through the TV and through the window at the same time. So then it somehow felt that I didn't know if the TV was more real than the window actually. And I think that we're so familiarized with violence that we don't actually question it even anymore. And I think that the screens, somehow they act as a frame to reality, almost to keep us in a distance from reality, almost as if we were afraid to connect with the haptic sensitivity to the real world. And even though I think that smartphones is a fantastic invention, I think that we have to be cautious of not losing our connection with the real world. So I wanted to present this video where I did ethnographic research, where for a year I was recording people in the tube in London and seeing how they interact with their smartphones. And one of the interesting things was that most of the people, they have like a rhythmical pattern between every tap in the screen. And in a book called The Naked Ape from Desmond Morris, where he analyzes the human being as a zoological creature, one of the interesting things he mentions is that when people have tics or repetitive behavior patterns, it's usually an expression of anxiety, and it's a way of controlling or feeling that they're back in their mother's belly when they were like a fetus, because it's a reminder of the beat of the mother's heart. So that's what I find interesting, because it's maybe in the old days it was a newspaper way of evasion. There are also many studies of how people tend to evade the contact in the public space. Also, the Morris had another theory that we as creatures, we have in our DNA more centuries of Paleolithical or nomad than actually civilized. So he was saying that in our nature, we're used to live in tribes of 20 or 30 peoples. We are not used to live in these big cities. So that's also another explanation of this kind of like feeling of alienation. And this kind of like brings me to something I would call the emptiness of joyfulness, because I somehow feel that we are living in a society where we're constantly pretending to be cheerful. It is but seen to be sad one day. But sadness or to suffer is part of our human condition. We're not perfect beings, but advertising is constantly bombarding us that we have to be like happy the 24 hours. And that's also a way of kind of like producing a disconnection with our own emotional beings. And this sculpture, I will tell you right away what it is about. Because last year I went to a dissection congress in Antwerp that was mainly for medical art students. So I was expecting to find the anatomy painting of Rembrandt, because I'm an admirer of Flemish art. So I was expecting like a bit of solemnity over an open corpse. That's what I guess that's what I would expect of human beings. But when I arrived there, I was very shocked by seeing how everyone was fighting to take pictures with the phone to the open body. And then I felt like, well, if that was my maybe grandfather who donated his body to the science, I don't know if I would like to see people like just taking pictures, like almost like fighting to take more pictures of the phone, almost as if it was a sensation. So I did this sculpture that shows people fighting with their phones to take pictures, and I put this guy falling back because I don't know why they need so many pictures. And when you compare it with like old rituals about dissections, for example, in the University of Padova, there was one of the first like spaces they used to do lots of dissections. It was all, of course, a spectacle. It was a sensation, but at least they had a bit of more. They play, for example, classical music before it started to prepare people. It was more like a ritual. Nowadays, you pay for a congress, you go and you see the open body. So there's no mysticism behind. I'm not saying this is something good or bad, but I do think it's something to reflect upon. So this sculpture, that day I took some pictures with my analog camera. And then when I was doing the induction at the Royal College, the technician did a stupid mistake because she put the fixer in a jar that said developer. So then I had a blank film. And then I felt maybe I didn't want to have those pictures. Maybe that's why it ended up blank. So I did the sculpture with the film on the top, like narrating the story. And this drawing here, it's of a mummy that was in the dissection room. And then when you think about what's going on in the international politics of many things, I think that everything has become like a spectacle. I don't know if anyone in this room has read The Society of the Spectacle of Guy Debord. Even though it was written in the 60s, I think it's very visionary or avant-garde, and he somehow portrays very well our current scenario. So one day I was walking in my hometown to my workshop, and there was a man who stopped to speak to me. And we went walking for a while, and he was a bit like totally anxious and moving a lot all the time. And then he said that he was worried that the police was persecuting him because he had complained that the mayor had cut a bush. So then I said, like, but don't you think you have a bit of a persecution delirium or something? And he said, like, oh yeah, that's the same thing that my therapist tells me. So then I was freaked out, and I didn't want to walk in the direction of my workshop because I didn't wanted him to know where my workshop was. So I went in a different way. So then I started reflecting about this idea of the spectacle, where we're constantly watching others and being watched. And that it's almost like we have this paranoia, and some people say this true, some others don't, that they even like spying our conversations through the phones. Have you ever been speaking about something and then you realize that you have advertisement about that and you haven't even written it in your phone? So we're all in this kind of like paranoia where we don't know what's real, what's not. And nowadays, actually, it's more important to be clever in social media and in Twitter and be populist to be the president of the United States or I don't know, whatever country, than actually like doing like real politics. So I wanted to show this sculpture that I presented in an exhibition I did in 2017 in Leeds Central Library. The exhibition was called The Fragility of Culture in a Disposable World. And the sculpture is called In the Jungle. So it's basically a group of half human, half animals in a carousel that's constantly going round. And they have the same position that people are using in the tube, that they're always like leaning down with their body. And this is a kinetic interactive sculpture. So when you get close to it, the sculpture moves. And what was very shocking about it was that the 14th of September of that year, at the same time there was a terrorist attack in London, someone went and did that crack on my base and left a message in the notebook of the library saying, our world is posable, this is a shit, what? A jihadist Islamic. Sorry for the bad word, yeah? But, and it was, I had to call the police to give notice of something like this, yeah? And then they were asking me, but was your sculpture political? And I was like, no, they're just animals in a carousel. And what I find even more interesting is what has happened with the sculpture afterwards, because I repaired the crack. And every time I have presented the sculpture, people are not really interested in the carousel or the kinetics. They're interested in seeing the crack and the story of the supposedly jihadist attempt that I think it was something one joking, but it's a joke of a very bad taste. But I think this is an anecdote that somehow portrays how politics and social media is kind of working. It's more about the sensationalism than a real fact. Connection, so that means the touching with the skin, but also involves the proprioception. Proprioception is your sense in an environment. So basically, have you never been in a room where you somehow feel that someone went behind you, even though he didn't make any noise? That is what is called proprioception. So the haptic connection means the connection to a place, but not only with the skin, but also with your body. So I had the opportunity to do an installation for an exhibition. I still don't know when it's going to be the private view. It's apparently on March, but I'm not sure. In a place in República 550 in Santiago in Chile. This place used to be a torture center of Pinochet dictatorship. Then it was abandoned and it was used by occupiers, and that room specifically was a graffiti workshop. So they asked me to do an installation for the place. And the first thing is that the space is so strong that it's really hard to work with it. So I was inspired by a book of Arturo Fontaine that's called The Double Life, where there's a woman that she starts being communist, doing like terrorist attacks in the dictatorship. Then they get her into prison. They torture her. And she falls in love with her torturer, with the Stockholm Syndrome. And she gives many names of the Communist Party. And in the moment they went to release her, she basically could not go free because she had received too many death threats from the Communist Party. So she has to change to the other side and becomes a torturer herself. So that's why in a place like this, I wanted to show an installation that was speaking about the duality of human beings, how we can go from hatred to love. And also I wanted to use the transparency in a way of not erasing the story of the space. And I don't know if you saw in the video, but there was some like mosaic collage that I added because I was somehow wanted to reinforce the idea of using an object of bad luck in a space that has a very bad energy. And going to my next chapter, I did an experiment where I wanted to contrast the physical and digital materiality. Because I had been reading lots of theory, but then I felt like, well, I want to actually prove it to see what happens. So with some of my classmates at the Royal College of Art, I did 5 small groups of pairs where I made them to model in wax and with a haptic hand. The haptic hand is like a hybrid between a robot and connected to a screen, as you can see in the image. And I asked them to model a house. I used a house as a topic because my idea was that the medium or the material would be more important than the actual piece. And what was very interesting was, at the beginning, I was expecting people to be more collaborative with the wax than with the digital medium. But it happened the totally opposite, because as people were already familiarized with wax and it was somehow more intuitive, people tend to be more enclosed when they were working with wax. Whereas when they were working with the haptic hand, they were constantly complaining and asking the other one if he knew how to use the tool. So then this could maybe open a new research to actually see if human beings only collaborate when they need help. And it's not only about collaborating because of genuine goodness of human beings. And so if you scan the 2 icons here, you can see actually the 2 examples of different houses that resulted from the experiment. So I will show you the videos. And what is interesting is that in the wax, people tended to have more control and to express that they were happier and that they felt relaxed. Whereas with the haptic hand, they expressed that they felt stressed all of the time. And also what I think that might happen is that it opened up the questioning is if the result of this experiment would be the same in 20 years more. Because probably in 20 years more, maybe for children, it would be more intuitive to work with a haptic hand than with a piece of wax. So this experiment actually made me realize it's not the medium that disconnects us, it's how we use the medium. Because we have a nature that we've always been inventing tools for our own purposes. And we're not the only animal that invent tools. Monkeys also do like little tools sometimes to eat or different things. So more than blaming the medium, I think that we have to blame the way we use it or we expect to connect to nature. And this is the last augmented reality I will show you. So if you scan this, you can see an object I will explain. So with a collective of multidisciplinary practitioners, that we call Alter Us, because we wanted to make the ego of the collective more important than the personal ego. We wanted to do a manifesto of the 21st century. So at the beginning we were thinking like, but does it make sense to make a manifesto in such a changing world? Because what seems true today, maybe it's not tomorrow. So then we decided to make the manifesto of questions. And we declared through a performance, I'm going to show a video, where we did, we first started with a recycling campaign to collect different glasses. Then we filled them with straws, and the straws inside had kitchen paper. So at the end, we invited the audience to sign our manifesto by planting a seed inside the straw. Then we left this garden in the communal garden in the old bath in Hackney, and to see how it grew. And some plants grew and overcame plastics, but others just died. So I think this is a kind of like metaphor of how we will go against plastic. So this was a performance. So at the beginning, the different performers were writing down the questions. And questions were related to sustainability, capitalism, the way we connect or collaborate, different social changes, also the process of questioning. What does it mean to make a question? So there you can see that performers were filling the straws with kitchen paper. Also, another interesting discovery through the recycling process was actually seeing that, for example, I went many times to the art school to ask for things, but at the beginning they forgot them and they just throw them away. And then when I went to a restaurant and I had a similar experience, so then you actually start understanding which is the will of people to recycle things. So they were planting the communal garden, the plastic garden. And I wanted to share, I mean, I have plenty of images of the plastic garden, but I find this image very strong because you see how the bin is basically breaking the straw. Well, then the plant actually died, but I think it's a strong image that somehow portrays how we're being suffocated by the plastic, and it opens up the question if we're going to survive or die with plastic. And the last thing I would like to show you, it's not directly connected with this, but it is in a different sense because it also speaks about our ability of inventing a virtual world or a conception about something. So this is a project called Norte, where with a Latin American collective, we decide to propose the South as the new North. And it's kind of like questioning, why do we always have this idea that the North will be superior than the South? So I will show you a video of the first exhibition I presented in Chile. And then I will show you another video of the second show that was in London. Because usually what happens is that shows travel from the Europe or North America to the emergent markets, because what is validated in the North can travel then afterwards. And the idea here was to do the opposite. So. So before showing the next video, for some of the people who might not have any connection with Latin America, one of the things that happens, at least in the culture world, but it is also in other areas of life, is that what is from Europe or the States is always seen as superior. So then, for example, from a person from an indigenous background, it's very difficult to get into a modern or a contemporary gallery because it's seen as ethnic or folklorical. So one of the challenges that this exhibition had was to present in a same space language that could speak from the ethnical perspective, folklorical, and also Western perspective in a same space, in a way of like challenging a bit the establishment. So then this was a show in London. Right. Thank you very much.